I took a night monitoring job on a hospital floor that was shut down 3 years ago. I think something followed me home. 3 months ago, I lost my job to automation. After 5 years in IT support, our company rolled out what they called an AI efficiency transition, and within weeks, half of us were gone. I told myself I would find something quickly, but savings thinned out faster than interviews appeared. That's how I ended up applying for an overnight monitoring position at St. Mark's Hospital. The listing was brief: restricted floor observation, night shift, no patient interaction required. The pay was higher than similar overnight roles, which I assumed was because of the hours. Most people don't want to sit alone in a hospital while the rest of the city sleeps. When I reached the hospital for my first shift, the building looked completely normal. Bright lobby lights, active emergency entrance, staff moving in and out. Nothing about it suggested that part of it had been shut down. Security directed me to the night supervisor, Denise. She introduced herself briefly and walked me toward the elevators without much small talk. She handed me a small brass key and explained that the fourth floor no longer appeared on the elevator panel. To access it, I would need to insert the key into a narrow slot hidden behind the control plate. Once turned, the 4 button would illuminate temporarily. I asked her why the floor had been closed. She paused before answering and said there had been internal incidents a few years ago. Nothing criminal, nothing public. Administration decided it was safer to deactivate the wing permanently rather than reopen it. Her tone sounded practiced, like something she had explained before. Before I stepped into the elevator, she handed me a laminated sheet titled Fourth Floor Night Protocol and told me to read it carefully once I got upstairs, and to follow it exactly. I asked if these were standard safety precautions. She held my gaze for a moment and said, "Just follow them." She checked her watch and told me her shift ended at 11 p.m. After that, I would be the only staff member assigned to that floor until morning security did their rounds. If I needed anything before 11, I could call her extension. After that, I was expected to manage the shift independently. She didn't wait for the elevator doors to close. The elevator ride to the 4th floor was quiet. When the elevator doors opened, the 4th floor didn't look abandoned. The lights were bright, the tile polished, the walls freshly painted. At the center sat an open circular nurse's station with 4 monitors, Corridor A extending left, Corridor B right, and the elevator directly across from the desk. Every patient room door was closed. Through the narrow windows, I could see stripped beds and large frosted windows that let in only a dull, diffuse glow. The floor felt sealed from the outside world. I set my bag down at the nurse's station and read the protocol sheet carefully. 4th floor night protocol. Do not enter any patient room under any circumstance. If you hear your name spoken from behind you, do not respond and do not turn around. Between 12:30 a.m. and 1 a.m., the intercom system may activate. Do not speak into it. At 1:15 a.m., Corridor B lights will dim for approximately 1 minute. Do not look down Corridor B during this time, directly or through camera monitors. If a strong antiseptic odor appears suddenly, return to the monitoring desk and remain seated for 5 minutes. Ignore any code blue announcements originating from this floor. If a patient chart appears on your desk and you did not place it there, do not open it. Room 417 is empty. Any sound from inside should be ignored. If the elevator doors open on the 4th floor after 2:30 a.m., Remain seated with both hands visible on the desk until the doors close again. Failure to follow these protocols may result in serious harm. I read the list twice. For a moment, I considered whether it was some kind of internal joke for night staff. But the floor itself didn't feel unserious. Everything looked maintained and deliberate. If it was a prank, it was an unusually committed one. I placed the sheet on the desk and looked around. The air smelled neutral. The lighting was steady. The monitors showed empty corridors and a closed elevator. At 11:20 p.m., I walked both corridors to familiarize myself with the layout. Every door was closed. Nothing appeared out of place. When I passed room 417, along corridor A, I slowed briefly, mostly because it had been singled out in the list. The door looked identical to the others. Closed. Dark interior. Frosted window glowing faintly at the far end. Nothing distinguished it. By 11:45 p.m., I was back at the nurse's station. The floor felt controlled and predictable. At 12:20 a.m., I checked the time and remembered the intercom rule. That was the first item tied to a specific window. I wasn't nervous. I was just curious. At 12:29 a.m., the intercom activated. I noticed the time because I had just looked at my phone. The protocol mentioned a window beginning at 12:30, so the 1-minute difference stood out immediately. There was a soft mechanical click through the ceiling speakers, the ordinary sound of a channel opening, and then I heard breathing. It wasn't distorted, it wasn't faint. It sounded close to the microphone, steady and controlled, like someone standing directly beneath a speaker panel and breathing into it on purpose. For a moment, I just listened, expecting an announcement to follow. When nothing did, my first thought wasn't fear. It was that someone downstairs was testing the new guy. A closed floor, a strange rule sheet, an overnight shift. It wouldn't have been surprising if this was some kind of informal initiation. I considered saying something, asking whoever was on the line if they were done, but I stopped myself. If this was someone trying to get a reaction, calling it out would only turn it into an interaction. It seemed smarter to ignore it and let whoever was doing it lose interest. There was also a more reasonable explanation. In older hospital buildings, systems aren't always fully separated. The intercom on this floor could still be connected to another wing. I might have been hearing an open microphone somewhere else in the building without realizing it. That explanation felt solid enough. The breathing continued without change. No whispering, no background noise, no shift in rhythm. After about a minute, it stopped. It didn't trail off. It didn't distort. It simply cut off. A second later, the intercom clicked closed. I waited. If it had been a prank, someone might have followed it with a laugh or a comment over the system. If it had been cross-wiring, I expected some bleed of another announcement. Nothing happened. The floor returned to its steady mechanical hum. I glanced at the monitors again. Corridor E was empty. Corridor B was empty. The elevator indicator remained dark. Everything looked exactly as it had before. That was when the unease started, not because of the breathing itself, but because of how contained it had been. I checked the time again, 12:31 a.m. By 1:10 a.m., the floor had settled back into its earlier stillness. The intercom incident already felt less significant the more I replayed it in my head. Cross-wiring or someone testing an isolated system somewhere else in the building still seemed like the most reasonable explanation. At 1:14 a.m., I checked the time again, remembering the lighting instruction. At exactly 1:15, the lights in Corridor B began to dim. The transition was smooth and controlled, not flickering or unstable. The brightness lowered evenly along the hallway, as though the system had been programmed for this exact adjustment. From the nurse's station, I could see the change clearly to my right. The protocol had said not to look down Corridor B during this period, either directly or through the monitors. After what had happened with the intercom, I wasn't entirely convinced the rules were anything more than overly cautious internal policy. If this was simply automated lighting maintenance, there didn't seem to be any practical reason I shouldn't observe it. So I glanced down the corridor. The hallway looked exactly as it had earlier, only darker. The doors remained closed. The floor was empty. Nothing moved. I checked the Corridor B camera feed as well. The image showed the same thing. A dimmed hallway with no visible change. There didn't appear to be any consequence for looking. I leaned back slightly, feeling reassured. If the rule had been written dramatically, the reality of it seemed ordinary. About halfway through the dimming cycle, I noticed the smell. It appeared without warning, sharp and sterile, unmistakably antiseptic. It was stronger than the faint background scent common in hospitals. This felt immediate, as if a container had just been opened nearby. I looked around the nurse's station for a source. There was no cleaning equipment in sight, no carts positioned along either corridor. The monitors continued to show empty hallways. What stood out was how evenly the smell seemed to exist. It didn't drift from one direction or gradually spread. The intensity remained consistent, no matter how I shifted in my chair. I remembered the instruction about unexpected antiseptic odor and read it again in my head. If detected, return to the monitoring desk and remain seated until it dissipates. I was already seated. That detail made me pause for a moment. The wording implied movement, as though the person reading it might be somewhere else on the floor when the smell began. I checked the time, 1:16 a.m. Even though I had tested the lighting rule without consequence, I decided to follow this one more carefully. There was no practical reason to move around while whatever system was cycling through the floor completed its process. As I remained seated, the antiseptic smell held steady in the air. After a minute or so, I became aware of a slight change in the background hum of the ventilation system. It wasn't louder, just subtly different in tone, as though airflow had redirected somewhere along Corridor B. The air near the nurse's station felt marginally cooler against my hands resting on the desk. I glanced toward the opening of Corridor B again. The hallway was still dimmed, the light casting longer shadows along the walls. From where I sat, I could see several of the closed doors along that corridor. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing moved. I told myself the airflow and the smell were probably connected. Some kind of automated disinfectant cycle running through an unused wing. The explanation felt thin, but it was enough to sit with. By around 1:20 a.m., the antiseptic smell began to fade gradually, as though whatever system had released it had completed its cycle. The air returned to its earlier neutral quality, and the ventilation hum settled back into the steady background tone I had grown used to. The lights in Corridor B brightened slowly to their normal level. The floor looked exactly as it had before the dimming. I felt some of the tension ease out of my shoulders. The sequence, strange as it had been, now seemed explainable. Lighting adjustment, environmental cycle, airflow change. Nothing had actually happened. Then one of the monitors flickered. It was brief enough that I almost dismissed it as a routine refresh. The image on the corridor A feed distorted for a fraction of a second and then stabilized. At first glance, the hallway looked the same as it always had. Doors closed, lights steady, no movement. But I kept staring at it. There was something slightly different. It took me a moment to notice what had changed. One of the doors along corridor A was no longer fully closed. I leaned forward in my chair, narrowing my eyes at the screen. The door to room 417 was open by a few inches. I felt a quick tightening in my chest, not because the door was open, but because I was certain it hadn't been earlier. I had walked that corridor at the beginning of the shift. Every door had been closed. I had paused at 417 specifically because the rule sheet had mentioned it. I rewound the recording through the console, scrolling back slowly until I reached the moment before the flicker. The hallway appeared normal, every door aligned evenly. I advanced the footage carefully. The image skipped during the distortion, and when it resumed, the door to 417 was slightly ajar. There was no visible swing of the door, no shadow passing in front of it. It simply appeared in a different position once the feed stabilized. I sat back and told myself it was likely nothing more than air pressure. The ventilation cycle could have shifted the latch if it hadn't fully caught. Doors in large buildings don't always seal perfectly, especially in unused wings where hinges aren't adjusted regularly. That explanation was reasonable enough that I didn't feel immediate urgency. I returned to the live feed and watched the hallway again. The door to 417 remained slightly open, while every other door along corridor A stayed perfectly aligned and closed. From the camera's angle, I could only see a narrow slice of darkness inside the room and the faint glow of the frosted window at the far wall, which diffused light without revealing anything beyond it. Nothing inside the doorway appeared to move, and the corridor itself remained empty and evenly lit. When I checked the time, it was 1:22 a.m., and for a moment I considered whether I was giving too much weight to something that likely had a simple explanation. I kept watching the monitor. The door to 417 remained open by the same narrow margin, and the rest of corridor A looked unchanged. After a moment, I adjusted the camera zoom slightly to get a clearer view of the doorway. The interior light was off, and only the faint glow from the frosted window at the far end of the room gave it any shape. At first, it looked like ordinary shadow, but the longer I watched, the more it seemed like the darkness inside the doorway wasn't evenly distributed. There was a subtle vertical shape interrupting it, just inside the threshold. It wasn't distinct enough to identify. It could have been part of the bed frame or a camera artifact caused by the earlier flicker. I told myself that low light feeds often distort depth perception. Even so, I didn't look away. I was still watching the monitor when the door to 417 moved. It didn't swing open suddenly, and it didn't creak. The shift was subtle, almost hesitant. The gap widened just enough to feel intentional. I froze, leaning forward slightly in my chair, waiting to see if it would continue. It didn't. The door settled into its new position and remained there. I replayed the last few seconds of footage to make sure I hadn't imagined it. The recording showed the same slow adjustment. There was no visible hand on the door, no shadow crossing the hallway, no change in lighting that would explain the movement. I sat back and tried to reason through it. If the ventilation cycle had altered air pressure in the corridor, the difference between the room and the hallway could have been enough to push the door further open. That explanation was imperfect, but it wasn't impossible. I looked at the live feed again. The door was now open wide enough that more of the interior was visible. The faint glow from the frosted window outlined the bed frame more clearly, and the vertical interruption in the darkness near the doorway was still there. It appeared slightly closer to the opening than before. The rest of corridor A remained empty. The elevator indicator in front of me remained dark. The floor was otherwise silent. After a few more seconds of watching the monitor, staying at the desk no longer felt reasonable. The rule prohibited entering patient rooms, not approaching them, and if the door had shifted because of airflow or a loose latch, I needed to confirm it. I stood up and stepped into corridor A. The hallway looked exactly as it had on screen. The door to 417 was open a few inches wider than the others, which remained fully closed. I walked toward it at a steady pace, listening to the faint echo of my footsteps against the tile. As I got closer, the interior appeared darker than it had on the monitor. The faint glow from the frosted window at the far end outlined the bed frame, but the space near the doorway was harder to read. The vertical shape interrupting the darkness was still there, and from this distance, it no longer resembled furniture. I stopped a few steps from the doorway. From this angle, I could see part of the room beyond the doorframe. The bed against the far wall, the pale light filtering through the frosted window, and the empty floor between. The shape near the threshold remained partially obscured by the door itself. It stood just inside the opening, close enough that the edge of the door hid part of it. I leaned slightly to the left to adjust my line of sight. As I shifted, the obstruction shifted too. Not quickly, not stepping forward, just enough that its outline became clearer against the dim interior light. It was vertical, human in proportion, and positioned where no equipment or furniture should have been. I felt my pulse begin to climb, not from sudden fear, but from the quiet realization that this was no longer a matter of ventilation or faulty hinges. The rest of the corridor remained silent behind me. The lights were steady. Nothing else had changed. Inside room 417, something was standing just out of full view, and it was facing the doorway. I stood just outside the doorway and forced myself to speak, because doing nothing felt worse than breaking the silence. Is anyone in there? My voice carried into the room and didn't echo the way it should have. The sound seemed to fade too quickly, swallowed by the dark interior. For several seconds, nothing happened. The shape inside did not move. The corridor behind me remained quiet. Then the door shifted. It moved slowly, inward, opening another inch or two, not enough to reveal what stood inside, but enough to widen the gap between us. The motion was steady and controlled, without the uneven swing of a loose hinge. It stopped with the same quiet finality as before. The opening felt deliberate, not forced, not accidental, deliberate, a subtle but undeniable invitation. My pulse climbed in my throat. I became aware of the dryness in my mouth. Every instinct told me that stepping forward would be a mistake, even though the rational part of my mind scrambled for any explanations. But timing is what unsettled me most. I had spoken, then it moved. I considered leaning just slightly past the doorframe, just enough to confirm what I was seeing. But the instruction returned to me with unusual sharpness. Do not enter any patient room under any circumstance. Up until that moment, the rules had felt procedural, overcautious, possibly exaggerated. Now, They felt specific. I felt exposed standing there. The open doorway in front of me was dark and watchful. The corridor behind me was quiet, but unseen. For the first time that night, I became intensely aware of how alone I was on that floor. I decided to step back and return to the nurse's station. The monitors would give me distance. Distance felt safer. I shifted my weight backward. That was when I heard my name. The voice didn't come from inside the room. It came from the corridor behind me, close enough that I felt it more than heard it. The voice was close enough that I felt a faint rush of air near the back of my neck. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't distorted. It sounded calm, familiar in cadence, though I couldn't place where I had heard it before. Every muscle in my body locked at once. The reaction wasn't controlled. It was electrical. A sharp, cold sensation shot from the base of my spine, outward, through my shoulders, and down my arms. My hands tingled. My breathing stalled halfway through an inhale. The rule surfaced instantly. If you hear your name spoken from behind you, do not respond, and do not turn around. I did not turn. I did not answer. But the paralysis that followed was worse than either option. The open doorway remained in front of me. The unseen presence stood somewhere behind me. And in that suspended moment, I realized I had moved into the only position on the floor where I could be surrounded without seeing either side clearly. The room felt closer now. The corridor felt closer too. And I had no way of knowing which direction had just spoken. I stayed exactly where I was. I didn't turn. I didn't step forward. The shape inside the room remained just out of full view, and whatever had spoken behind me did not repeat my name. The silence stretched longer than it should have. My breathing felt too loud in my ears, uneven now, harder to control. I became acutely aware of how exposed I was standing there, suspended between the open doorway and the unseen space behind me. Nothing touched me. Nothing moved. And that somehow felt worse. Then, without warning, the door to 417 slammed shut. The sound detonated down the corridor, sharp and violent, breaking the standoff instantly. It wasn't a hinge settling or air pressure shifting. It was forceful, deliberate. The shock of it tore through whatever restraint I had left. I turned. The movement wasn't planned. It wasn't logical. It was reflex, the body overriding the rule. For a fraction of a second, I saw only the empty stretch of Corridor A behind me. Then I walked quickly, not thinking, just moving, back toward the nurse's station. It wasn't strategy. It was retreat. Only when I reached the desk did the realization land. I had turned. The rule had been clear. If you hear your name spoken from behind you, do not respond and do not turn around. I had not spoken, but I had turned. The thought settled heavily in my chest, and that was when I saw the patient chart lying in the center of the desk. It hadn't been there when I first sat down. The folder was closed and positioned neatly, aligned with the edge of the station, as though someone had taken care placing it there. The rule came back to me immediately. If a patient chart appears on your desk and you did not place it there, do not open it. I didn't touch it. Not at first. Then I saw the tab. My name was printed on it in clean typed lettering, centered exactly where a patient's name should be. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. The part of me that still wanted logic tried to reason through it. Shared name, old file, some leftover administrative error that had somehow surfaced at the worst possible moment. But the floor had been closed for 3 years. There were no patients here. My hand lifted slightly before I stopped it. Opening the chart would answer a question, but it would also break another rule. And the last time I broke one, something responded. I lowered my hand. Whatever was inside the folder didn't need me to confirm it. I grabbed my bag instead. The decision felt sudden, but it wasn't impulsive. Staying no longer felt like observation. It felt like participation. As I turned toward the elevator, the doors slid open. I had not pressed the call button. The interior was brightly lit and empty. The fluorescent lights inside casting a sterile glow into the dimmer fourth floor. Another rule surfaced. If the elevator doors open on the fourth floor after 2:30 a.m., remain seated with both hands visible on the desk until the doors close again. I looked at the clock. It was past 2:30. My first instinct was to step inside, to leave, to remove myself from whatever sequence I had triggered. But instinct had not protected me so far. The rules had. I walked back to the nurse's station, sat down, and placed both hands flat on the desk. The elevator doors remained open. The air felt heavier now, waiting. Then the banging started. It came from corridor A, from inside, room 417. The first impact shook the door hard enough that I heard the frame rattle. The second came faster, then another. The blows were uneven but powerful, as though something inside was throwing its full weight against the door, over and over again. They had said the room was empty. It did not sound empty. The elevator doors behind me were still open, and I kept my hands exactly where they were. The banging against room 417 continued to the left of me, heavy and uneven, each impact echoing down the corridor. I kept my hands flat on the desk, fingers spread slightly against the cool surface, forcing myself not to react. The elevator doors remained open in front of me. The interior was brightly lit, sterile and empty. For several seconds, nothing changed. Then the lights inside the elevator flickered once. Not a full blackout, just a brief dip in brightness, as though the voltage had stuttered. The banging continued. I kept my eyes forward. When the lights inside stabilized again, the elevator was no longer empty. There was something standing at the back wall. It had not walked in. It had not entered from the hallway. It was simply there. It stood upright against the back wall, human in proportion. But something about the alignment felt wrong. Its shoulders were level, yet its head was angled slightly farther to one side than a neck should allow. It wasn't looking at me. It didn't need to. The banging from room 417 grew more frantic, the impacts landing faster now. The figure inside the elevator did not move. It did not step forward. It did not lift its head. It simply occupied the space. My entire body wanted to stand, to run, to break the rule and get as far away from the fourth floor as possible. But the rule was clear. Remain seated, hands visible. Wait. So I stayed exactly where I was. After several more seconds, the banging stopped. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. At the same moment, the elevator lights flickered again. When they stabilized, the interior was empty. The doors began to slide closed. They shut smoothly, sealing the fourth floor off once more. I did not move until the panels met and the indicator light above the frame dimmed. Only then did I let myself breathe fully. I stayed seated for several seconds after the elevator doors sealed shut, listening for any sign that the floor was about to escalate again. The corridor was quiet. Then the monitor flickered. The image on the corridor A feed distorted briefly, and when it stabilized, the door to room 417 was opening again, slowly this time, inch by controlled inch. The darkness inside the room shifted with it. A shadow separated from the interior and stretched across the threshold, moving forward with steady intent. That was enough. I stood immediately, grabbed my bag, and ran for the elevator. I didn't look back at the monitors. I didn't look down corridor A. I pressed the call button with more force than necessary and kept my eyes on the indicator above the doors. The fourth floor remained silent behind me. When the elevator arrived, it opened normally, empty, bright. I stepped inside and pressed the lobby button. The doors closed without hesitation. The descent felt steady and uneventful. No flickering lights, no sudden stops. Just the mechanical hum of cables lowering me back into the part of the hospital that still made sense. When the doors opened in the lobby, everything looked ordinary. A nurse walked past without noticing me. A security guard stood near the entrance, scrolling through his phone. The air smelled like disinfectant and coffee. Normal. I walked out of the building without turning around. The drive home felt longer than the entire shift. I kept checking the rearview mirror without meaning to. Every few seconds, my eyes lifted, expecting to see someone sitting in the back seat, perfectly still between the headrests. There was nothing there, just the empty outline of my seats and the faint reflection of passing streetlights. At one red light, I nearly turned around completely to make sure. I stopped myself. I didn't want to risk seeing something that hadn't been there a second earlier. When I finally pulled into my parking space, I cut the engine and sat there gripping the steering wheel, listening to the ticking sound of metal cooling under the hood. My hands were still unsteady. I checked the back seat one last time before getting out of the car. It was empty. I walked quickly to my apartment door and locked it behind me as soon as I stepped inside. The place looked exactly the way I had left it earlier that evening. The air was still, the lights were off, and nothing appeared disturbed. For the first time since leaving the fourth floor, I felt some of the tension ease slightly. I set my bag down and stood there for a moment in the quiet. That was when I heard it. The sound was faint but steady, controlled breathing that did not match my own. It wasn't loud or exaggerated, and there was no scrambling or movement to accompany it. It was simply present, consistent, and close enough that I couldn't dismiss it as plumbing or airflow. I froze where I was, listening carefully. The sound wasn't coming from behind me near the front door, and it wasn't outside the apartment. It was coming from the hallway that led to my bedroom. The rhythm was slow and measured. I live alone, which made the sound harder to dismiss. I didn't walk down the hallway, and I didn't call out to see if someone would answer. Moving toward it felt like stepping into the same mistake I had made on the fourth floor. Instead, I backed away slowly and locked myself in the bathroom without turning on the light. I sat on the edge of the tub and listened as the steady breathing continued somewhere beyond the hallway, unhurried and controlled, as if it had all the time in the world. It didn't move closer. It didn't move away. It just remained there. At some point before sunrise, the sound stopped. Not gradually, not fading. It simply wasn't there anymore. I unlocked the bathroom door after the sky had begun to lighten and checked the apartment. Nothing was out of place. Since that night, I make sure every door in the apartment is closed before I go to bed. I don't leave the hallway exposed, and I don't fall asleep easily. Sometimes, when the apartment is completely still, I hear breathing again, and sometimes it stops the moment I hold mine, as if it's waiting to see which one of us breathes first.